PhD and MSc degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. You were 7 years old at the time, so I recall you graduated. Sorry. Good. I believe the computer alone now. Okay, glad to
Oh, I love that. Press coverage of flying saucers. Studying laziness.
He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist by such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics. I knew that, I was just testing you. And McDonnell Douglas, working in such highly advanced classified, eventually canceled programs as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. He became interested in UFOs in 1958, and since 1967 has lectured about them at more than 600 colleges and 100 professional groups in 50 US states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 countries, in addition to various nuclear consulting efforts. He has published more than 90 UFO papers and has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs, including the Larry King 2007 and twice in 2008, and many, many documentaries. Stanton is the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident and co-author Crash and Corona, a definitive study of the Roswell incident. Top Secret Magic, his controversial book about the Majestic 12 group, established in 1947 to deal with alien technology, was published in 1966 and has already gone through 6 printings. An expanded new edition was published in 2005. Stan was presented with a Lifetime UFO Achievement Award in Leeds, England in 2002 by UFO Magazine of the UK. He is co-author with Kathleen Martin of a book the book in 2007, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. The city of Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, declared August 27th, 2007, Stanton Friedman Day.
Isn't that great?
His book, Flying Saucers and Science, was published in June 2008 and is in its 3rd printing. His newest book, also co-authored with Kathleen Martin, is Science Was Wrong, and it was released in June of 2010. He has provided written testimony to congressional hearings, appeared twice at the United Nations, and been a pioneer in many aspects of ufology, including Roswell, Majestic 12, the Betty Hill Marjorie Fish star map work, analysis of the Delphos, Kansas physical trace case, crashed saucers, flying saucer technology, and challenges to the SETI, which really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate Cultists. He has spoken at more UFO symposia than anyone else. Stanton T. Friedman is a dual citizen of the USA and Canada. You can visit his website, which is stantonfriedman.com. And I'm most proud to say he's also a friend of mine. Please give a huge welcome to Stanton Friedman.
Appreciate your coming out tonight on such a beautiful Sunday where you could watch football or have fun, instead of being here. I originally was supposed to give this presentation at the MUFON conference in July in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I had a heart attack on June 27th, and the doctor didn't think it was a good idea for me to go there or to Roswell, my 2 big events I missed. But I'm back on the road again and feeling fine for going to work. I mean, I figure both my parents lived to be 90. I turned 80 in July. I figure I got another 10 years, so let's make the most of it. Let's keep working.
Yeah.
It may seem like a strange title for a physicist to put out, but much of what we think and believe and wonder about flying saucers is a result of the failure of the press and the scientific community to do their job. I grew up with the crazy notion that journalists and scientists both had the same goals. They wanted the facts, they wanted the truth. Unfortunately, I was wrong about both. We'll try to remedy some of that today. And, you know, I think of so many examples of the failure of the press to do its job, and I wonder in how many other areas is that true? I mean, the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print? Ha! We'll talk about a good example of their laziness and misrepresentation. But one of the reasons I wanted to do a paper on this was because I'm constantly being told by people about the foolish comments being made by the nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them, the debunkers and others. And to try to make clear that there really is a lot of data out there, facts, solid information. You'd never know it from reading the books of the SETI cultists. It's unbelievable. They're interested in extraterrestrial intelligence, but they refuse to look at any of the data related to the visitation by extraterrestrials. You realize we have not been given one piece of evidence that there's somebody out there sending radio signals appropriate to our technology. We've had long-distance radio since 1901. The planet's over 4 billion years old, and everybody else is stuck at the same level as we are? That's ludicrous. But you won't find any references in their books. They refuse to read the books with the data about flying saucers. I know, I've done debates with some of these people. I've also done something else. I've asked my audiences, after I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, how many people have read this one, and then that one, and so forth. I'm lucky if I get 2% who've read any of them. So there are 4 basic rules for debunkers, whether you're in the press or the scientific community or the debunking community. 1, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. 2, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. 3, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And they get by with all of those. I'll give you specific examples. I'll remember the 4th example shortly. Hey, I've got an excuse. I'm 80. Now, many people don't realize there have been at least a dozen PhD theses done about flying saucers. And I better clarify. I prefer the term flying saucers because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Very few men are great-grandfathers. I happen to be one, incidentally, and I'm constantly worrying about what kind of a world is my great-grandson going to grow up in, seeing how things are happening around us. I mean, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? When a planet spends $1 trillion a year on things military, and thousands of kids die needlessly of preventable disease and starvation every single day? I mean, I get asked, why don't the aliens just come down and land and make themselves known? You know, land on the White House lawn. It's a no-fly zone, incidentally. Why would anybody want to talk to us as equals? I keep trying to find out what kids learn in school about our track record, we Earthlings. How have we behaved? And it's easy to forget. Well, some of you aren't old enough to remember, but it's easy to forget. We Earthlings killed 50 million of our own kind in World War II. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities. Bombed the hell out of them. We have tested 2,000 nuclear weapons. We've only dropped 2 on people, thank goodness. But would anybody looking at us and say, oh, this is an advanced civilization? I don't see how. So anyway, there's Dr. Herbert Springs, who went on to be the dean of the journalism school at Drake University in Iowa. This is from his PhD thesis. The high degree of ridicule present in the UFO phenomenon was reflected in the press coverage. The coverage has been marked by superficiality, redundancy, silliness, careless reporting, and a lack of relevant information. The lack of relevant information was also attributable to the reluctance of the press to ferret out information about the phenomenon and those involved in it. That's a pretty strong judgment in a PhD thesis. There are some others which weren't quite as strong as that, but he actually read almost 10,000 clippings, which is a punishment I wouldn't wish on anybody. I read a lot, but not that many, I don't think. So that's what academia says. Now, I show the picture of the late Major Jesse Marcel. This is from the Roswell incident. And that's one of many examples, that incident, of how the press botched it. Now, it's a little easier to understand the coverage, in 1947. After all, it was only 2 years after the end of the war. We'd been saved from destruction by the evil Axis. People trusted the government, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying they should have or shouldn't have, I'm just saying they did. So if a story went out saying that, it was just a radar reflector weather balloon combination, after they had said it was a flying saucer, and after that second explanation, they came up with a third explanation, and after that, a fourth, my favorite one, we'll talk about that. Crash Test Dummies. Now, you probably think of that as the name of a musical group, isn't it? I'm not quite that old-fashioned, and I don't know that there is such a group. But
Oh, yeah.
there was something that the New York Times really goofed on. The fourth explanation. Front page on the Sunday Times above the fold. There is no better location for an article in the American press. Now, as you'll see as we go along, there's some very good reasons for saying that's total nonsense, that explanation. It's hard, but they got away with it, which scares me. How many other things do they get away with? Giving entirely false information about it. Now there's 4-star General William Blanchard. And I show his picture, A, because he was the commander at Roswell. I'll be talking more about Roswell as we go along. But some of the critics say, oh, he was just a loose cannon. They must have sent him to Siberia. No. He went from being a colonel to a 4-star general. All of those promotions had to be approved by Congress, incidentally. And when he died, he was Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Before becoming that, he'd been basically in charge of the Strategic Air Command and had thousands of nuclear weapons under his control. He was not a loose cannon. by anybody's definition of the word. He was West Point, of course, class of 38. And I did, incidentally, I try to go for the facts. I talked to he was dead when I started my investigation, so I couldn't talk to him. But I talked to his daughter, I talked to his first and second wife, I talked to his two sons. His daughter was useful, incidentally. Gave me some useful tips. But there's a big article, well, there's a New York Times obituary about him, big one. Special ceremonies up at the Air Force Academy. And yet the noisy negativists say just a loose cannon. We'll come back to the Roswell story. This was on the July 9th newspaper in Roswell, 1947. And when the Air Force wrote their big report, they left out some of the key lines which change your view of what the ranchers said and what the facts were. I mean, and they got away with it. That's what's important. They got away with it. I did talk to the rancher's son, incidentally. He was dead when this started too. The last paragraph. I am sure what I found was not any weather observation balloon, he said. But if I find anything else besides a bomb, they are going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it. See, they picked him up and took him to the military base there, and kept him and gave him instructions. Let's put it that way. Incidentally, how many of you have been to Roswell? A few. It's a small town, about 50,000 people, and it's been rejuvenated by the UFO Museum and the annual conference, festival, whatever you want to call it, and it seems so appropriate to me. You see, there's a little bit of history here. Roswell was the home of the 509th, which just happened to be the most elite military group in the entire world in 1947. Why do I say that? Because they dropped the atomic bomb. They were the only ones in 1947 who had atomic bombs. Nobody else in the world. They dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped two more in Operation Crossroads in the Pacific in 46. So we're not talking about a bunch of dinks there with nothing else to do at that time. The Cold War was just heating up in 47. So Roswell was special. They have a 13,000-foot runway there, which is mighty large. And it's 6 feet thick at the end because B-36s used to take off from there, loaded with bombs, atomic and otherwise. A pretty special place. And then something happened. Lyndon Johnson was not voted, the people in New Mexico didn't vote for Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 presidential election. So naturally, being Lyndon, as soon as possible, he closed Roswell and moved the 509 to Texas. What a big surprise. So it seems appropriate to me. The town had done nothing wrong at all. This was the biggest employer in town. And suddenly the base is closed. So it seems appropriate to me, having been at almost all of the Roswell annual festivals since the 50th anniversary, that they should benefit from the public's interest in this government lie about Roswell. Poetic justice or something like that, you might say. Originally some of the townspeople, when a museum was planned and stuff, you want us to be the UFO capital of the world? What are you, crazy? Well, pretty soon the money started coming in. The people started coming. They built motels, they built more restaurants. The streetlights have alien faces on them, you know. It's fun. Oh, I get people giving me a hard time. Well, Stan, they have costume parades down there. Yeah, if you're taking your kids there, you want something for them to do. I've stood in the back of a convertible and waved at the kids on the sidewalk. There's nothing wrong with that. I should add, Roswell is 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from Amarillo, and 200 miles from El Paso. It ain't on the way to nowhere. If you're there, it's because you want to be there. A lot of people go through Albuquerque, 200 miles away. So I mentioned that to give you a little better perspective from what you might get, and we'll talk about some of the noisy negativists talking about this. But anyway, I began the civilian investigation of the Roswell incident. And people say, what do you mean? I said, I was the first to talk to Major Marcel. Why did he call you? He didn't. What happened, to give it to you straight, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to speak at Louisiana State University. And I was scheduled to do 3 television interviews at the local television station. People from the campus had brought me over to the station. And I'd done the first 2, and the third reporter, this is in 1978, mind you, the third reporter was nowhere to be found. No cell phones back then, believe it or not. And so the station manager is giving me coffee, he's looking at his watch, he knew that I had other things to do. And out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? His next sentence changed my life. He handled wreckage of one of those saucers you were interested in when he was in the military. What? Where did that come from? And there was nobody else around. He wasn't making jokes. He was serious. I said, well, what do you know about him? He lives over in Houma. Well, that didn't tell me anything because I didn't know where Houma was. I've been there since to talk to Jesse. He's a great guy, rolled ham radio buddies, you really ought to talk to him. Okay, the reporter showed up, I did the third interview, I was busy the rest of the day. We had a great crowd at the university that night. So the next day I was at the airport early and I thought, well, why don't I see if I can find this Jesse Marcel in Houma, wherever it is. Called information, this is before the internet incident. There was a time before the internet, believe it or not. Called information, there was a listing for a Jesse A. Marcel. I called him, explained that I'd been talking to Bill Allen at the television station. He knew him, ham radio, and I told him that I'd had a clearance for 14 years and I was very interested in flying saucers. So he told me his story. He didn't call me, I called him. And I found out later, he's one of the few people that couldn't deny his involvement. His picture, that picture that I showed, was in newspapers around the world. So he couldn't say, I didn't have anything to do with that. I mean, it was clear that he did. So he was the basic intelligence officer for the 509th. He didn't sweep the floors. And I've talked to people that he briefed. Plane crews used to make long simulated missions out of Roswell. They fly the East Coast to simulate a bomb drop and stuff like that. And he was the duty officer of the day on a Sunday, July 7th. I want to say 6th, but 6th or 7th, doesn't matter. When he gets a call from the sheriff. This rancher had come in with some very strange stuff. And there was an agreement between the sheriff's office and the base that anything that might be related to the base, it could be a drunken airman, it could be an accident in which somebody was injured. Colonel Blanchard was very interested in good relations with the town. So the sheriff calls the base, talks to Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer. Jesse goes and looks at the stuff and meets the rancher and tells Colonel Blanchard that there wasn't anything conventional there. I don't know what this stuff was, but it certainly wasn't anything normal. Jesse was familiar with plane crashes and stuff like that. He'd served in the Pacific, lit the 509. So Colonel Blanchard said, take one of our counterintelligence officers out with you and see what's out there, because the rancher said there's lots of this stuff out there. And the counterintelligence officer was because they worry about spies at Roswell. The only atomic bombing group in the world. New Mexico, lots of the work, the first atomic bomb was exploded in New Mexico. That's where we were flying the captured German V-2 rockets. It's where there was other classified activity. 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico. So if you're going to say where in the United States would spies be looking to see what's going on, it was New Mexico. Makes perfectly good sense. So Jesse Marcel and Sheridan W. Cabot follow the rancher out. It's impossible to tell somebody where the crash site is. You know, people say, well, you know, all you got to do is look at a street map and tell them how many blocks this way and that way. No streets. It's out in the middle of nowhere. There's a lot of nowhere in New Mexico. It's a beautiful state, but there's a lot of nowhere there. So they follow the rancher out, some of the last part of the trip cross country. They stay in their sleeping bags in a barn, and the next day, the rancher shows them where all this wreckage was. And I say all this wreckage. It covered an area 200 yards across, it says in the newspaper, actually more than that, but good enough. Even though Colonel Cabot, 40 years later, said, oh, it covered an area 20 feet square. And he got away with it too. Quoted by the Air Force. Who would know better? He was there. Anyway, they go out there the next morning, and here's this area strewn with very small pieces of foil-like material, some other materials. Didn't look like anything Jesse had ever seen connected with anything, part of any airplane. He told me there was nothing conventional out there. That was in our first conversation. And they loaded the 2 vehicles with some of the wreckage, leaving most of it out there, and went back to town. He didn't say anything about bodies. There was probably a crew compartment, but that landed a couple miles away. It's gently rolling country out there. Dry country, incidentally. Gets very warm in the summertime. And Jesse stops at home, shows his 11-year-old son and his wife some of this stuff. See, at that time, nobody said the most classified stuff around. Who knew? Next day, he brings it into the base, and that's when the fix went in. Colonel Blanchard tells Walter Haupt, the base public information officer, put out the press release, and it went all over the country from Chicago west. Because of the time change, there were no articles in the Washington Post or the New York Times. Except the next day, the denial, this one, and a few others. And that was the end of it. Now, Walter Haupt, who died a few years back, and as I'll show you, one of the noisy negativists said, an unknown public information officer put out an unauthorized press release. And we're both being interviewed. I'm in Roswell and he's in California. We could hear each other, we couldn't see each other. And I said, you don't know his name? Well, no. I said, well, I've had dinner with him. I've been in his home. He was the public information officer for the most elite military group in the world. He also was a very competent bombardier. He was chosen to drop the instrument package over one of those two tests in Operation Crossroads in the Pacific in 1946. You got to be one of the best ones to do that, because if you don't get the instrument package in the right place, what's the point of the test? So this is the anonymous public information officer. And he and Blanchard were pretty close to each other. And the notion that Walter Howe would put out a press release on his own without approval of the boss is absolutely absurd. He'd have wound up in the brig in 2 minutes. That's just not how, this is chain of command. Most elite group in the world. You know, you got to think about these things. The debunkers don't. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If you're thinking, you have to. Anyway, they put out the story, the cover-up went into place, and until I got involved in 1948, that's when things started to change. And I shared my information with a colleague. We worked hard. In a year and a half, we found 62 people connected with the case. And I'll admit, I got lucky. I called the local, I looked up an editor and publisher. What do I know about Roswell, New Mexico? Oh, they got a newspaper. The Roswell Daily. And I called and said, I'd like to talk to the editor from 1947. This is in 1978. Oh, he's long gone. What do you need? I said, well, I've got an article. We had articles because my colleague had an article from England, the Flying Saucer Review, still being published, in which an actor in England had said that he had been driving through New Mexico when he heard on the radio about a crashed saucer near Roswell. And his son lived in Canada, and my colleague called him to try to get the date. I talked to him later, but Huey Green was his name for interview from England. I did talk to him on a later trip, but anyway, he could pin down the date the first week or so in July 1947. So Bill went to the University of Minnesota Library. He lived up there, Minnesota. Started looking through the paper. There was a story. Gave us the names of lots of people. And the next year and a half, as I say, we found 62 people. Now, when I say I got lucky, when I called the newspaper asking for the editor and told them what I was looking for, I said, I got a story about a guy named Walter Hout. His name is spelled 4 different ways in the newspapers. And before I could finish the sentence, she said, oh, his wife works here. What? You don't expect a guy who, as it turns out, came from Chicago, who was stationed there in 1947, to still be there in 1978. But he was. And I called information to get somebody named Brazel. That's the rancher's name. And she said, what city, please? I don't know, southeastern New Mexico. So she looks and she said, well, I've got a Brazel in Carrizozo. I said, is that in southeastern New Mexico? And she said, yes. So I got his number. That was the rancher's son. The chief of staff to the general who was over the 509th, Blanchard's boss, was a guy named Thomas Jefferson Dubose. And I knew Blanchard was dead. I knew General Ramey, who was Blanchard's boss, was dead. I thought, gee, maybe Dubose went to West Point. Many of the officers who were in service in 1947 were West Pointers, because the quick guys had left, or was over in 45. Called West Point. Yeah, he's still alive, lives in Florida. I worked a little bit, found him. met with him when I was going down to visit my parents in Florida. Sharp guy, he was in his 80s. And I should be so sharp at what age he is. But, and he tells me, standing 3 feet away, he took the call from General Ramey's boss, General McMullen, telling him, gave him 3 orders. The press release had gone out. Get the press off our back, I don't care how you do it. Send some of that wreckage up here today with one of your Colonel Couriers. This is from Fort Worth. McMullen was in Washington, D.C. And I don't want you ever to say anything about it again to anybody, not even your buddy, General Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? He went on to be, he was a general, retired general when I saw him. No, sir. When a 2-star general tells a colonel, and they know each other in both West Pointers, to keep his mouth shut and to do those other things, he does it. I've had people ask, well, why did he follow orders? Because that's what you do, especially in 1947, especially West Pointers. Some people don't realize that the military has certain rules, especially after the world's greatest war. I'll put greatest in quotes, but that any way you want. Anyway, the first book came out in 1980. And the number of witnesses we found has gone up. Almost all of them are dead now, of course. There is a DVD, which I don't have any up here because I sold them out in Exeter, New Hampshire 2 weeks ago, which has firsthand testimony from 26 witnesses. I mention this because so often I hear people say there is no evidence, there is no data, it's all second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand. That's malarkey. You can watch those guys. You may not be able to talk to them anymore. But, so Roswell is an important case for me. And it's, people say, why are you still working on that? Because it's the proof. The United States government recovered the wreckage of a flying saucer and alien bodies. Now, Major Marcel didn't talk about alien bodies. That was a separate part of this event, apparently in a crew compartment that was separate from the major part of the wreckage, which was strewn all over the field. But certainly it set government policy for a long time to know that the planet's being visited by high-tech vehicles. And people say, why the cover-up? I think every country on the planet would love to be able to have the same flight technology as the saucers. You know, up, down, back, forth, right angle turns, high speed, no noise, no visible external engines, no wheels, no tail, and being able to go out, and away. Don't we spend tons of money trying to, I mean, look, the stealth aircraft cost $10 billion to develop. That indicates it was a national priority, I think is a fair thing to say. Okay. There's the rancher, Mac. There's the two people I was talking about. General Ramey on the left, then Colonel Dubose on the right. He became general, and he was when I saw him. This was taken in Ramey's office. The picture went all over the place. And if you look carefully, General Ramey is holding a little piece of paper here. And if it was taken with one of today's little digital cameras, you wouldn't be able to read it. But it was taken with a very good press camera back then. And people have enlarged it substantially and been able to read it. And it says something about victims of the wreck. Now, weather balloons and such don't have victims of the wreck. And the description of the wreckage by the people who were there rules out this weather balloon radar reflector, which any 2-year-old can tear. One of the big things about the wreckage was is extraordinarily strong. You could fold it, make it small, release it, and it would open up on its own. But you couldn't tear it. There were I-beams that you couldn't break, couldn't cut, had strange symbols on them that we couldn't read. A lot of mysteries. There's Tommy and I. He was, I think, 87 at the time. Still had possession of all his sense, believe me. But you gotta find these people. And it wasn't that hard. Oh yes, I love this picture. One of the explanations for Roswell, the fourth one, was crash test dummies, not the music group, as I said. The one in the middle is the dummy. Now, I found Colonel Madsen living in New Mexico, as it happens, and I met with him, had breakfast with him in Albuquerque. And he made a couple of very important points. He was in charge of the program back then. In the first place, for the test to be meaningful, you see, airplanes are flying higher and farther and faster. And if your plane is damaged and you want to get out, eject, you kind of want to test the ejection seat before you put pilots in it. And you also want to know things like, how long do you fall before you pull the ripcord? You don't want to freeze on the way down if you come down too slowly from 40,000 feet. Darn cold up there. Anyway, for the test to be meaningful, the dummies had to be 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. He stressed that to me. And you'll notice that the dummy is in flight gear. That's not for decoration. That affects the heating of the body and the drag with the air. You'll further notice, incidentally, the dummy is made out of wood. Now that matters because when they hit the ground, oftentimes an arm or a leg comes off. Not too surprising when you stop to think about it. But we're supposed to believe that anybody in New Mexico seeing one of these crash test dummies in full flight gear, you understand, would have thought it was an alien and we were being invaded, Where do they get this nonsense? I don't know. Funny thing, the New York Times didn't bother to locate Colonel Madsen. Instead, they ran the story, Crash Test Dummies Explain Roswell's story. Incidentally, none were dropped until 6 years after Roswell. So we have time travel for crash test dummies. That's the latest thing in advanced technology. You can see I get a little irked at some of this stupidity. And the fact that the press fell for it. This is the New York Times. This guy's picture, this picture appears in the 2nd Air Force report. Why didn't they check?